journalist, activist, and writer Chris Hedges. He's written, as many of you know, he's very well known, I'm sure, in this part of the world. He writes and speaks extensively on war, religion, American culture, empire, and the conflict in the Middle East. Some of his books include War as a Force That Gives Us Meaning, Empire of Illusion, Death of the Liberal Class, and Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. He's written for Foreign Affairs, Granta, The New Statesman, Harper's, Mother Jones, The Nation, The New York Review of Books, and a magazine based right here in Vancouver, Adbusters. He writes a weekly column for Robert Scheer's web magazine, truthdig.com, and he's a senior fellow at the Nation Institute. And beyond the world of writing, he's also supported the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011, teaches inmates in New Jersey prisons, amongst many other activities. So without further ado, and because we are a little bit pressed for time, I'm just going to introduce, please welcome Chris Hedges. We will have time for questions afterwards.
I have walked through the barren remains of Babylon in Iraq and the ancient Roman city of Antioch, the capital of Roman Syria, which now lies buried in silt deposits. I have visited the marble ruins of Leptis Magna, one of the most important agricultural centers in the Roman Empire, now isolated in the desolate drifts of sand southeast of Tripoli. I've climbed at dawn up the Mayan temples in Tikal, while flocks of brightly colored toucans leapt through the jungle foliage below. I've stood amid the remains of the ancient Egyptian city of Luxor along the Nile, looking at the statue of the great pharaoh Ramses II lying in pieces on the ground, with Percy Shelley's poem Ozymandias running through my head. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Civilizations rise, decay, and die. Imperialism, like colonialism, consumes itself. Time, as the ancient Greeks argued, for individuals and for states, is cyclical. As civilizations become more complex, they become inevitably more precarious. They become increasingly vulnerable. And as they begin to break down, there is a strange retreat by a terrified and confused population from reality, an inability to acknowledge the self-evident fragility and impending collapse. The elites at the end speak in phrases and jargon that do not correspond to reality. They live isolated in guarded compounds, whether at the court, at Versailles, the Forbidden City, or our modern palatial estates. The elites indulge in unchecked hedonism, the accumulation of greater and greater personal wealth and extravagant consumption. And they are deaf to the mounting suffering of the masses that are repressed with greater and greater ferocity. Life becomes about accumulating as much as fast as you can on the way down. Resources are ruthlessly depleted until they are exhausted, and then the hollowed out edifice collapses. The Roman and Sumerian empires fell this way. The Mayan elites, after clearing their forests and polluting their streams with silt and acids, retreated backwards. As food and water shortages expand across the globe, as we engage in dirtier and more environmentally destructive forms of extracting natural resources, especially fossil fuels, as poverty and misery triggers uprisings and street protests in the Middle East, Africa, and Europe, the elites do what all elites do. They build a pervasive security and surveillance apparatus to protect themselves and those who plunder and destroy on their behalf. They launch endless wars, which for them means endless profits. They construct grander monuments to themselves. They plunge their nations deeper into debt. And as the edifice around them shakes and unravels, they take it out on the backs of workers and the poor. They drive them harder and harder to maintain a level of consumption and a level of profit that is unsustainable. The collapse of the global economy, which wiped out a staggering $40 trillion in wealth, was caused when our elites, after destroying our manufacturing base, sold massive quantities of fraudulent mortgage-backed securities to pension funds, small investors, banks, universities, state and foreign governments, and shareholders. The elites, to cover the losses, then looted the public treasury to begin the speculation over again. They also, in the name of austerity, began dismantling basic social services, set out to break the last vestiges of unions, slashed jobs, froze wages, threw millions of people out of their homes, and stood idly by as we created a permanent underclass of unemployed and unemployed. And this is how all civilizations ossify and die, and ours is no exception. It was no different on Easter Island. The inhabitants, when they first settled the 64-square-mile island during the 5th century, found abundant fresh water and woods filled with Chilean wine palm, a tree that can reach the size of an oak. Seafood, including fish, seals, porpoises, and turtles, and nesting seabirds were plentiful. Easter Island society, which split into an elaborate caste system of nobles, priests, and commoners, had within 5 or 6 centuries swelled to some 10,000 people. The natural resources were devoured and began to disappear. Forest clearance for the growing of crops would have led to population increase, but also to soil erosion and decline of soil fertility. Paul Bahn and John Fenley write in Easter Island, Easter Earth. We consider that Easter Island was a microcosm which provides a model for the whole planet. Like the Earth, Easter Island was an isolated system. The people there believed that they were the only survivors on Earth, all other land having sunk beneath the sea. They carried out for us the experiment of permitting unrestricted population growth, profligate use of resources, destruction of the environment, and boundless confidence in their religion to take care of the future. The result was an ecological disaster leading to a population crash. Do we have to repeat the experiment on this grand scale? Do we have to be as cynical as Henry Ford and say history is bunk? Would it not be more sensible to learn the lesson of Easter Island history and apply it to the Earth Island on which we live? The signs of imminent devastation are undeniable. Common sense demands a radical new response, but the race toward massive species extinction, including our own, accelerates. Canada's environmental and regulations and civil liberties, like those in the United States, have been demolished. Fantasy and illusion, spectacle and entertainment fill our empty, emotional, and intellectual lives. The global economy is built on the erroneous belief that the marketplace, human greed, should dictate human behavior and how we organize societies. It posits that economies can eternally expand. It assures us that the ecosystem can continue to be battered by massive carbon emissions without major consequences. It promises that there will always be plentiful and cheap oil. And its systems of propaganda and education, where universities churn out technically proficient, systems managers trained only in how to maintain and perpetuate global capitalism reflect back to us these absurdities. The inability to confront simple truths about human nature and the natural world, the failure to question predatory economics, leaves us unable to articulate new social, economic, and political paradigms. Oligarchs, as Aristotle, Machiavelli, Alex de Tocqueville, Adam Smith, and Karl Marx knew, are schooled in the mechanisms of manipulation, subtle and overt repression and exploitation to protect their wealth and power. Foremost among their mechanism is the control of ideas. Ruling elites ensure that the established intellectual class is subservient to an ideology, in this case, neoliberalism and globalism, that justifies their exploitation of human beings and their unchecked greed. For our misery is their paradise. The ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expression of the dominant material relationships, Marx wrote, the dominant material relationships grasped as ideas. The blanket dissemination of the ideology of neoliberalism through the media, academia, systems of entertainment, and even religious creeds, such as those peddled by the Christian right, along with the purging, especially in academia and the press, of critical voices, have permitted our oligarchs to orchestrate the industrial world's largest income inequality gap and normalize the exploitation of the global poor, especially poor people of color. It is not simply that 1% control a quarter of the nation's income in the United States. It is not simply, as Joseph Stiglitz points out, that they have the best houses, the best educations, the best doctors, and the best lifestyles. But they have effectively built systems of indoctrination that determine how we view the world. And until we shatter those systems of indoctrination, until we recover another language and another reality, we remain captive to these oligarchic elites. We remain submissive, not only through the networks of global security, but through the power of ideas. And these ideas have infected the left as effectively as they have infected the mainstream society. The reconfiguration of spirituality to ask, how is it with me, replicates the narcissism of the wider culture. The misuse of identity politics as a form of anti-politics, as if electing a woman president who wages endless war and sends out fleets of militarized drones, who is in the pocket of Wall Street and the fossil fuel industry, and who has no intention of reversing the eradication of our civil liberties, is somehow an improvement over a black president who did the same thing. This is not to deny the pervasive racism and sexism that subjugates people of color and women, but to recognize that identity politics has been cynically manipulated by the power elites to refuse to actually redistribute power to the oppressed, and in particular, poor people of color, and perhaps especially women. The shining example of the sickness of a predatory society revolves around the issue that caused some controversy around my talk: the global trade in prostituted girls and women, and the explosion of pornography that attempts to eroticize the domination, torture, and physical abuse of girls and women. Civilizations in decline, from Caligula's Rome to the decadence at the end of the Ottoman and the Austro-Hungarian empires, always become hypersexualized and depraved. The primacy of personal pleasure, obtained at the expense of others, especially the weak, is the defining characteristic of a civilization in its death throes. I spent 2 decades as a reporter covering conflicts, many of them centering around the domination of natural resources in Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans. The only group wars produce in greater numbers than prostituted girls and women are killers, refugees, and corpses. I was with Marine Corps units that were soon to be shipped to the Philippines, where they would pick up prostituted Filipino women in the bars they referred to as LBFMs, little brown fucking machines, a phrase first coined by the US occupation troops that arrived in 1898 in the Philippines. Sexual violence directed at Asian women by white men, and any Asian woman in this room can tell you how unrelenting and commonplace such violence and sexual racism is a direct result of Western imperialism, just as sexual violence against Aboriginal women is a direct result of white colonialism. And the same behavior is found on the outskirts of the massive extraction industries that often spawn the wars I covered in places like the Congo. This sexualized racism, however, is hardly limited to wars or extraction sites. It is the driving force behind the millions of first world male sexual tourists that go to the developing world, as well as those who seek out poor women of color who are trafficked to Canada and within Canada. Some of these women, and some of those who engage in this violence and sexualized racism against women, are within a few blocks of where I am speaking tonight. Wars and extraction industries are designed to extinguish all systems that give life: familial, social, cultural, economic, political, and environmental. And they require the obliteration of community and the common good. How else could you get, as is now happening, dragline operators in southern West Virginia to rip the tops off the Appalachian Mountains to get at coal seams, as they turn the land they grew up in, and often their ancestors grew up in, into a fetid, toxic wasteland where the air, soil, and water will be poisoned for generations. The violence, plunder, destruction, forced labor, torture, slavery, and yes, prostitution are all part of unfettered capitalism, a single evil. And we will stand united or divided against this evil. To ignore some of the oppressed, to ignore parts of this evil, to say that some forms of predatory behavior are acceptable and others are not, is to ignore all of the oppressed. And it will render us powerless before this evil. We are called to build a world where all people have the opportunity to choose security, safety, and well-being over jobs that leave them traumatized, sick, maimed, and destroyed. I don't see the point of this fight if that is not our goal. Sexual violence and sexual submission cannot be set apart. Although the traffickers, pimps, brothel, massage parlor owners, Johns, and their apologists would like us to do so. From unfettered capitalism and the legacy of colonialism and imperialism. It is an integral piece of a world where wholesale industrial slaughter kills hundreds of innocents in Gaza and over 1 million innocents in Iraq and Afghanistan, where the mentally ill are thrown onto streets, where a country like the United States warehouses 2.3 million people, mostly poor people of color, 25% of the world's prison population in cages for decades, where life for the working poor is one long emergency. It is all one world. It is all one system, and this system in its entirety must be overthrown and destroyed if we have any hope of enduring as a species. Absolute power over another, as I saw repeatedly in the wars I covered, almost always expresses itself through sexual sadism. And this is why rape, porn, and prostitution of women by men is so prevalent in war, just as it is in mining camps, oil fields, the tar sands, and other extraction industries. Colonialism along with imperialism, or capitalism along with imperialism and colonialism, its natural extension, is perpetuated by racist stereotypes. Some of you may have seen the film American Sniper, and you should watch the parody Canadian Sniper on YouTube if you haven't seen it, where Iraqis are turned into one-dimensional, evil human bomb portals that deserve to be gunned down by the hero in the film, even if they are women and children. Those who set out to destroy another people in their land, whether in Iraq or the territories of the First Nations, must dehumanize who live on, nurture, and love that land. This dehumanization is used to justify domination. Imperialism, like colonialism, depends on racial stereotypes, including sexualized racism and the forced prostitution of women of color, to annihilate the culture, dignity, and finally resistance of indigenous populations. And this has been as true in Canada as it has been in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. Indigenous traditions and values are portrayed as primitive and worthless. The oppressed are turned into subhumans, people whose lives do not really matter, who stand in the way of the glories of Western civilization and progress, people who deserve to be eradicated. What is done to girls and women through prostitution is a version of what is done to all of those who do not sign on to the demented project of global capitalism. And if we have any chance of fighting back, we will have to stand for all the oppressed, all those who have become prey. To fail to do this will be to commit moral and finally political suicide. To turn our backs on some of the oppressed is to fracture our power. It is to obliterate our moral authority. It is to fail to see that the entire system of predatory exploitation seeks to swallow and devour us all. To be a radical is to stand with all who are turned into objects, and especially girls and women who the global economy and much of the left has abandoned. The Europeans and Euro-Americans who conquered, exploited, and murdered indigenous communities were not only making war on a people and the earth, but on a competing ethic. The traditions of the First Nations and the pre-modern indigenous societies, the communal structures of these societies, had to be destroyed for colonists and global capitalists to be implanted the negative ethic of capitalism. In indigenous societies, hoarding at the expense of others was despised. In these societies, all ate or none ate. Those who were respected were those who shared what they had with the less fortunate and who spoke in the language of the sacred. These older indigenous cultures held fast to the concept of reverence. It is the capacity to honor the sacred, including the sacredness of all life, and here I speak as a vegan and include animals, which capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism seeks to eradicate. We need to listen to women, and especially indigenous women, as we seek to recover this older ethic. They treat Mother Earth like they treat women, Lisa Bruner, the program specialist for the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, said. They think they can own us, buy us, sell us, trade us, rent us, poison us, rape us, destroy us, use us as entertainment, and kill us. I'm happy to see that we are talking about the level of violence that is occurring against Mother Earth because it equates to us, women. What happens to her happens to us. We are the creators of life. We carry that water that creates life just as Mother Earth carries the water that maintains our life. So I'm happy to see our men standing here, but remind you that when you stand for one, you must stand for the other. The earth is littered with the physical remains of past empires and civilizations, ruins that cry out to us about human folly and hubris. We seem condemned as a species to drive ourselves into extinction, although this moment appears to be the denouement to the whole sad show of settled, civilized life that began some 5,000 years ago. There is nothing left on the planet to seize. We are spending down the last remnants of our natural capital, including our forests, fossil fuel, air, and water. This time collapse will be global. There are no new lands left to pillage, no new peoples to exploit. Technology, which has obliterated the constraints of time and space, has turned our global village into a global death trap. The fate of Easter Island will be writ large across the vast expanse of planet Earth. The ethic peddled by capitalist and imperialist elites, the cult of the self, the banishing of empathy, the belief that violence can be used to make the world conform, requires the destruction of the communal and the destruction of the sacred. This ethic, if not broken, will mean the end of not only human society, but finally the human species. The elites who orchestrate this pillage, like the elites who pillaged other parts of the globe in the past, probably believe they can outrun their own destructiveness. They think that their wealth, privilege, and gated communities will save them. Or maybe they do not think about the future at all. But the death march they have begun, the relentless contamination of air, soil, and water, the physical collapse of communities, and the eventual exhaustion of coal and fossil fuel themselves, will not spare them or their families, although they may be able to hold out a little longer in their privileged enclaves than the rest of us. They too will succumb to the poisoning of the natural elements, the climate dislocations, the freak weather caused by global warming, the spread of new deadly viruses, the food riots and huge migrations that have already begun, as the desperate flee from flooded or drought-stricken pockets of the earth. The predatory structures of capitalism, imperialism, and colonialism will have to be destroyed. The earth and those forms of life that inhabit the earth will have to once again be revered and protected. This means including a very different vision of human society. It means rebuilding a world where domination and ceaseless exploitation is a sin, and empathy, especially for the weak and the vulnerable, including the planet itself, that has long given us life, is held up as the highest virtue. It means recovering the capacity for awe, for reverence, for the sources of life. Once we stand up for this ethic, once we include all people, including girls and women as an integral part of this ethic, we can build a resistance movement that can challenge the corporate forces that, if left in power, will extinguish us all. Thank you.
If you can change your vote when you change your mind, that is what democracy is all about. Now polling.ca.
Perpetual democracy doesn't mean that you have to vote every day. It just means that you have the right and the ability to vote anytime you want. And that is what perpetual democracy is all about.